Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest webinar from Thrive. Today, we'll be covering a really broad topic, addiction, and we'll try and do our best within the hour to cover as much as we can. This video will be made available on YouTube at some point over the next week, and there'll be a whole list of resources for people who may be looking for some support. And we'll also try and post links to some organizations on our Twitter feed at some point today. As with all of the other webinars, there's an option for you to ask us questions during the webinar, which we'll do our best to try and answer. Again, unfortunately, we're not able to answer very specific questions. And if you do have any specific questions that you feel haven't been addressed today, then we'll be talking about how you can access support. So if you are struggling with a problem, please speak to somebody about it. Please go and see your GP about it. I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel today. We've got a number of people joining from different areas of expertise. We've got clinicians, internationally renowned clinicians joining us, and people with lived experience. So the idea is we've had as much coverage as possible through people that have helped people with addiction problems, but also people that have gone through it themselves and have lived experience. We've put together a pretty ambitious program today, so I hope that we get a chance to run through as many of these topics as we can. You'll see them there. We're going to try and think a little bit about what we mean by addiction and what that entails, what sort of sets of problems that usually comes with. We're going to think about treatment and interventions at some point, how you support other people with an addiction problem, and how you might get support yourself as somebody who's caring for somebody with an addiction problem. We're going to think about the music industry. So why is it that so many people who are involved in the arts or theatre or music seem to have problems with addiction? And then right towards the end, we'll be answering your questions. So again, if you have a question at any point, please don't hesitate to ask, and we'll do our best to answer it right at the end. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Adam Huxley. I'm a consultant clinical and forensic psychologist. I'm also the co-founder of Thrive. I spent most of my years in clinical work in addiction services, both within the NHS and the independent sector. So it's something that I've been interested in throughout my career, really. And I've seen a lot of changes in relation to how services are organised. I'm really pleased to introduce Alex. Good afternoon, Alex.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting discussion, hopefully. My name is Alex Capella. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm professor of addiction research at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I've been working in clinical psychology and addiction services for well over 30 years, and always trying to find ways of helping people, but also trying to do research that help us to understand better how to help people with addiction problems. And a particular interest of mine, where my research has focused over the years, has been the impact of addictions on family members and people who are close to those experiencing the addiction problems, and how we could try and help family members in their own right, but also how we could maybe broaden the base of helping people with addiction problems by involving families in some way in the treatment journey, which hopefully we might have a little bit more time to talk about. And more recently, I'm also the Director of Mental Health Research in the NHS Trust where I work.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Really happy to have you here. Good afternoon, Matt.
Just need to unmute myself. Hi, thank you so much for asking me and having me on this webinar. I'm very excited to be here. My name's Matt Thomas, and I am currently one of the chair of trustees of the charity Music Support, and a co-founder of that charity. And I am a marketing and communications consultant, working with another addictions charity called Action on Addiction, which is a wonderful national addictions charity. And I'm also a co-founder of the conference in ICAAD, International Conferences on Addiction and Associated Disorders, which accidentally became the biggest conference of its kind in Europe a few years ago. I came from the music industry. I joined the music industry in 1991, and I myself suffered from addiction and other mental health issues. And I was fortunate enough, after a long struggle, to get sober in 2006, at which point I sort of realigned my career, and that's what led to founding Music Support almost 5 years ago. And, you know, thanks for mentioning addiction in the music industry, Adam. And I think, you know, what I've found, my experience is that actually the music industry is a microcosm of society, and it's a microcosm of the world. And my experience, certainly in getting sober and abstinent in the 12-step fellowships and peer support was, you know, there's almost nothing stronger than one individual helping another individual. And that was really what we applied to Music Support. You know, I thought, how can I help? Well, I know the music industry. In fact, that's probably all I know. And so why don't I try and help in the music industry? I found it particularly a difficult environment to get sober in back in 2006. And I thought, if there's anything I can do to help people on their journeys to recovery, then I'd like to try and do it. And that's what led to my involvement in Music Support, and to sort of realigning my career and now using my marketing and communications experience, helping out other addictions, charities and services.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting for us at some point over the next hour just to think a bit more specifically about why there's been a change in relation to people finding it easier to get support, I guess. And maybe it was a bit different 10, 15 years ago, particularly in the music industry, but I think there's just generally more support available for people. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those services this afternoon, which people can reach out and get support from if they're struggling with something. Thank you, Matt. Rachel, good afternoon.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name's Rachel Lander. I'm also a trustee of Music Support. I got sober from alcoholism and addiction in 2007. And I also found it, like Matt, quite a difficult environment to get sober in and stay sober in. And the problems in my sort of side of the industry, which is I do a lot of I do some classical playing, and I work in the West End, and I do a lot of film and television sort of session recordings in recording studios. And it's a very, very high pressure industry, and there is a lot of addiction that people are afraid, I think, to be open about, which I think is definitely changing in recent years, but I know that I am one of the only people that is talking about it kind of publicly when people ask me, and I'm very open about. It's kind of my mission is to sort of destigmatize performance anxiety and addiction, which musicians that I know, and my parents are musicians as well, who divorced and they remarried 2 other musicians, so, and they're all in different sides of the industry, and it is the stigma about mental health and performance anxiety and the tools, you know, which are sometimes destructive tools to manage those things, are definitely still quite a taboo subject. So I'm very keen on kind of opening that conversation up in the areas of the music industry where it's not, like they've particularly in the classical sector, where it's definitely not talked about very much. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think if it's one of the things we can do today is to try and break that stigma that unfortunately is still around in terms of reaching out for support.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's difficult when you have a problem to admit it to yourself sometimes.
Exactly.
So it's not surprising, is it, that it might be really difficult to reach out for support if you're worried about your job, or you're worried about your reputation, or you're worried about your opportunities. So
Yes.
hopefully at some point, you know, we'll try and get onto a discussion about how we can support others to reach out and get support. Okay, so we had a really large response in terms of questions, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for sending them through. And we thought we'd start with probably the largest question that we have in terms of time that we could take to answer it. And Alex, maybe you could start us off on this, because it's something that a lot of people have asked. You know, what is addiction, and what does that mean in terms of particular types of difficulties, and how might it harm? So if I can ask you to maybe talk us through, you know, your feelings about that question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to get us started on this, and I'm particularly keen to also hear Matt and Rachel's experience, because they can speak also from their own journey in terms of what sense they made of addiction. Addiction is such a big word, isn't it? And is a kind of abstract word, and it's fair to say that people have debated what addiction is over the years, and they're still debating it. And sometimes these debates get very you know, very hot, if you like, and people have got very ideas close to their heart and argue for them. But in a sense, I think probably in terms of my work with people, it's the more helpful thing is not to get so much hooked up in what addiction exactly is in terms of concepts, but how might it manifest itself, so that you could, if you're worried about yourself or you're worried about someone else, you can try and look for some of those signs that there's something that's not quite right here, and maybe something needs to be done. I'm also interested in the stigma points raised by both Rachel and Adam, because in a sense, there is such a lot of stigma for these problems, that how can you easily recognize yourself that you've got a problem when you know what the perception is of this problem out there. So I think if we went some way in reducing the stigma for addiction problems, we probably do more good than a lot of things we can do on a much smaller scale in terms of support for people. But on to the question. So what is addiction? Well, again, the systems have been polarized. So there's, and have changed over time. So whereas in the early days, addiction was mostly dominated by substance-related addictions, such as alcohol and other drugs, opiates, with the processes defined very much influenced by the relationship between someone and a substance. As time has gone on, addiction has also focused on other particular behaviors. For example, gambling has come into the fore now, because people were finding that similar processes that were occurring in people who were struggling with an addiction to a substance were occurring in relation to other particularly behavioral activities that could become addictive in a sense. I mean, the main thing I think for me is to think about addiction as what people call a biopsychosocial idea, if you like. So it's got biological components, it's got psychological components, and it's got social components. Some of the contrasts of different ways of understanding addiction, for example, contrast where there's a particular group of people who are addicts, if you like, who are only people who are at risk of becoming an addict, and there's another lot of people who are at no risk whatsoever. And the evidence suggests that this is not quite the case, that potentially any one of us, given the right circumstances, the right biological, or the wrong ones, may I say, biological, psychological, and social context to where we are, could potentially go on to develop a very serious addiction, irrespective of our path. And the other contrast is is this something that's that comes predetermined, or is it a reaction of a person in the here and now moment? So some theories, for example, there's something called the prime theory, which suggests that you're very much the decision to engage in an addictive behavior is a momentarily decision and is not so much influenced by what happened before. So these are all different views. I think that the things for me to think is a very complex phenomena. If it hadn't been so complex, we probably would have found better solutions for it, and we wouldn't be having this kind of debate here. It's worth thinking about addictive behaviors, perhaps, because it's easier to think rather than in broad terms of an abstract concept, to think about what the addictive behaviors that we can observe are. And it's fair to say that the addictive problems tend to build over time. They don't happen just from one day to the next. And once they develop, they become self-perpetuating problems, which are very, very difficult to deal with. So, for example, we heard, a few minutes ago how a particular environment in the music industry creates a very difficult environment in which to change your behavior. And it's possible that you started your addictive behavior for some reason, but then once it becomes established, you're in an environment that makes it very difficult for you to break that habit. And then eventually you might get to a point where you need to make significant changes so that you can begin to affect a change in your addictive behavior. Kind of things that I would bear in mind if I'm thinking about is someone having a serious addiction problem is the kind of problems with control people have. And is this notion, when you see people who are becoming addicted, you sense that their control over the substance or the behavior they're addicted with begins to wane, and they find it very, very difficult to exercise control. They start engaging in risky behaviors, so they start doing things that they wouldn't normally do before they became engaged. So if you're drinking, you might start driving while you're drinking, doing things that you wouldn't have done before, and taking some more risks. And you might develop, particularly if you're dealing with a substance, what people call tolerant and withdrawal type of experiences. So that kind of physical processes. So what happens if you say you're drinking alcohol, over time, you need to consume more and more alcohol to get the same effect that you were getting initially for that amount of alcohol. And that's called tolerance. And it means you become more and more entrapped in that relationship between yourself and the alcohol. And the counterpart of that is that if you become high on tolerance, when you try to stop that, you get this withdrawal symptoms, which is the kickback of that. So you start getting a physical reaction, which makes you want to go back to consuming the alcohol because you know that that's what's going to calm that behavior. But in a sense, what you see in the clinical service I've seen over the years is when people come with, they finally make a decision that they want to change, is that kind of loss of control that they experience, where they feel that their lives are not so much anymore under their control, but that something's taking control, and they're kind of being driven to continue with this addictive behavior. That's very difficult to break away. And again, just finally, and I'll pass on to my colleague, motivation. In recent years, the idea that addiction is very much driven by motivational drives, so that people make some sort of decision based on motivations and how they see their future that might either facilitate or get on the way of continuing with the addiction behavior. But that motivation is as or even more important than some of the physiological components that I was talking about before. And the other issue is that being ready to change, which I think we might talk about when we talk about treatments, and is giving people the opportunity to come to a point when they themselves are ready to contemplate or to start to think about change. And this might not happen straight away. When you're looking from outside, you might see someone who you think this person needs to do something about the addiction. That doesn't mean that the person themselves would see it in that way. And it's how you can work with them to come to some common agreement of what it is. I think I've gone a little bit all over the place, but I'm trying to highlight some of the key elements, I think. I think any model of addiction needs to be broad and needs to include both the biological components as well as the psychological components. And all these things happen in a social context. So if you ignore any of this, you're only going to end up with a partial view of addiction that's going to be limited as to how far it can take us. So that's just some thoughts to kick us off.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to touch on a point you made right at the end there, Alex. I always think, there's potentially a really simple answer to this question is, what is addiction? Is what it means to you as the person that's experiencing it. And as you say, our ability to help people really, is determined by their understanding of the problem. And that's really how we can be helpful for people, to try and understand their frame of reference. So it becomes more about what's happened to you and what experiences have you had that have led you to this point of your life. Matt, Rachel, I'm just interested in your view on this as people that have gone through it and lived it. How would you answer that question?
Matt, you go. Good luck.
Well, no, interesting. Thank you, Alex. I think everything that you said is fascinating and really, really rings true, and connects with a lot of my own personal experience of addiction and recovery. And I think what really stood out for me was when you mentioned the thing about the relationship with the substance or the behavior, in fact. And that's kind of that's something that I've quite recently learned at Action on Addiction, actually, as well, which is one definition that's used there is the relationship with the substance or the behavior becoming more important than any other relationship with friends or family, and even ultimately at the expense of the relationship with yourself. And in my relationship with alcohol was and other substances was a very, very tumultuous, is that the right word, and dramatic affair that lasted, so I don't know, 25 years or so, and it was a very, very destructive relationship, and the only ending to that relationship was abstinence. And it's strange, and it's sort of like being in recovery is having a relationship with somebody who still exists. That person is still there, the substance still exists, the behaviors still exist. The other thing you were talking about, the stigma side of things, I never set out to be an alcoholic. I never set out to be an addict. I didn't mean to. And I think it's that loss of control. It's that is partly responsible for the stigma, because it's embarrassing at first to think, oh my God, he can't take his drink. I remember people referring to me like that, and I was like, what do you mean? I drink more than you. Of course I can take my drink. Of course I can take my drugs. But the truth of the matter was that I had totally lost control of that relationship. And for me, another good definition of addiction is that, if I have one, I have to have 20. It's that old thing of one is too many and 1,000 is never enough. And obviously I never meant to behave in the often abhorrent ways that I behaved. And one of the reasons that there is such a stigma attached to addiction is because it comes with behavior, and it's very difficult for the person who is not the addict to understand that it's actually the behavior is not the person, and because we seek self-soothing in substances that cause us to behave in ways that we would not normally behave, then it kind of becomes, like you said, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So I said, that was my experience of it, and I'm very open about it now, that I did behave in some fairly inappropriate ways, but I never meant to. I didn't wake up this morning and say, I'm gonna do such and such. It would happen as a result of taking the first drink or taking the first drug and then losing control.
Thanks, Matt. I just want to touch on a point you mentioned, something that I've certainly heard a lot in my career. I'm sure Alex has as well, and that's shame and guilt. and these might be reasons why people feel that they can't reach out and get support. But from your experience, was it often the case that when you speak to other people with similar types of experiences, they felt the same things? They felt ashamed of the things that they had done. So, there was that sort of, feeling that actually other people are feeling the same way that I do.
100%. And I think that, that's the great thing about peer support groups like the 12-step fellowships, is that it's very rare to be able to be able to share something deeply shameful and personal in a room full of other recovering alcoholics and addicts without seeing, most of the heads nodding, and somebody coming up to you and saying, I relate to that, I did the same thing, whatever that thing may be.
Yeah. So it might be difficult to maybe go and explain some of those things to your GP, for example, but you mentioned a couple of mutual aid organizations like AA and NA. They are people with very similar sets of experiences who won't judge you, who will be there to support you. So if it's feeling as though it's really difficult for somebody to reach out to their GP or a healthcare professional, there are other organizations, mutual aid organizations that are run by people with the same sets of experiences who won't judge you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first people who helped me years and years ago said to me, look, Matt, the only thing that can shock me is cannibalism.
Right.
And I hadn't indulged in cannibalism, so I never shocked him.
Right. Yeah, it's such a big thing to be in an environment where you're not judged and you don't feel as though people are making appraisals of you. So I think that's one of the benefits of mutual aid organizations. It's absolutely the case that the people that have been there and have experienced very similar things are there to support you. So I think we'd absolutely encourage people to check NA, CA, AA out if it doesn't feel right for you to go to a healthcare professional. Rachel, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I found everything that's been shared has been really fascinating. I think what's difficult when you are in active addiction is that if you're, in my case, I was just addled with vodka. I couldn't have a kind of sensible thought process about addiction. And so such a huge part of the disease, if we're going to call it a disease, which I choose to now, is denial. And but the scariest element of it for me is that you're the last person to know that you've got it, which obviously, Alex will know this in his work with families of alcoholics. People saw me, the kind of drinking I did, I just had this terrible anxiety, and I just drank. I never sort of drank to be like a party girl or anything like that, but I drank medicinally. So I had vodka in a water bottle about my person all the time. And when the fear came up, I would drink and it would immediately take it away at first. And obviously what Alex talked about, the tolerance, it took more and more. My behavior became erratic and my life became very small. Because like Matt shared, my relationship with that bottle of vodka became more important than my family, my work as a musician. And in the end, and mercifully, it became untenable very quickly for me. So I got sober when I was very young. I was 23, but I knew nothing of addiction, and I was obsessed because I think this is the nature of the illness. I was obsessed with not being an addict, that it was the last thing I wanted to be. So when I was in those peer groups, I was introduced to kind of the language of addiction, and when people talked about denial, that made sense to me. But the thing is, it's very difficult to access that kind of help when you're in the illness as well. So it is a sort of tragic disease, really, because you are the last person to know that you've got it, even if lots of people are telling you this is out of control. I do kind of feel like addicts that get sober, we sort of all share a sort of moment of grace or clarity, where it kind of becomes clear that relationship with that substance is the problem, and it's not all the outside influences in our lives. Because it's very easy to blame, you're drinking on, well, I'm in this relationship that's toxic, or I've had a difficult relationship with my family, or in my case, I was a classical musician at college and it was incredibly high pressure. and I was having to put ball gowns on and play concertos and stuff, and I felt completely out of my depth. When I drank and I used, I felt like I could do that, you know, but I sort of think it's a miracle that anybody gets sober with a disease that tells you that you haven't got it. So yeah, it's really fascinating to hear all the different components of it and why it's so tricky, and why this, and yes, the behavioural aspect of it definitely sort of exacerbates the stigma of being an alcoholic, you know. And even like when I say to my grandparents, who are really proud of me, you know, and I've been sober for 13 years and I've had this whole life in recovery, my grandparents still don't like me saying I'm an alcoholic in public. They go, oh, don't call yourself that, you know. It's just not, you know. So I'm trying to reclaim the word, and recovering alcoholic kind of is empowering. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, let's move on to another question that we've had. Alex, if you could.
Okay, that's
Take this on.
what's the difference between addiction and a bad habit? This kind of builds up on what we've been talking about a little bit. I mean, I would say in a way, you could argue that any addiction is a very harmful bad habit, but perhaps not all bad habits necessarily are going to lead to an addiction. And you know, again, we can see easily the extremes, like with all these things, but it's somewhere in the middle when does perhaps a bad habit might become an addiction. I think the things I would probably say differentiate this, because I think the other problem is that you can, if you go too far in saying, well, addiction is just a habit, you're kind of almost minimizing the seriousness of the problem that we're dealing with. But equally, I think there is increased recognition that you don't just need substances to have a significant addiction problem. And I think part of the difference is probably the time and effort that is going to be required for you to make a change from an addiction problem as compared to a bad habit. And it's also looking for certain signs. I think we touched on them before. What are the negative impacts of the habit? Are there harms arising from it, which suggests it might be veering towards an addiction? Are you putting yourself at risk as a result of this particular habit, if we call it a habit, to do with drinking or drug use or gambling? Do you get symptoms when you stop engaging in this? Again, we talked about some of those physiological organisms. And importantly, I think this, you see this time and again in people as an addiction develops, is has the person taken attempts to cut back, which have been unsuccessful? When you talk to people, by the time they come to see you, if you ask them, they would have tried to cut down before, and they find that they can't do it. They can't do it by themselves. And at some point they realize that maybe it might be helpful to get some help. And also they start hiding the behavior from others, the kind of things Rachel was talking about so clearly. So hiding the behavior, trying to cut down and reduce it, but unsuccessfully, having symptoms and having really negative harms from the behavior. I would have thought if you look at the kind of substance addictions we've been talking about, as well as the behavioral addictions, those would separate what might be a less severe regular habit from what's a serious harmful addiction.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Matt?
I was just going to add to that, actually, that I think that's really, really clear. My experience also of was it just a bad habit or an addiction, was I would often find myself doing it against my own will. I was unable to stop my car from pulling up outside the off license, no matter how much I swore on the journey home from work that I wasn't going to drink that evening. It was like my car had a will of its own, and it would just pull up outside the off license. And all of a sudden I'd found myself walking home with a bag of clinking bottles again. And the obsession and the compulsion, AA describes it as both an obsession and a compulsion. And sort of, you know, literally I would spend all my time thinking, where's that next drink going to come from? Where's that next drug going to come from? When's the next opportunity going to be? to partake. And it just the complete and utter obsession of the mind and the compulsion to drink even when you didn't want to.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think that's an important point. Yeah, sorry, just an important point to talk about there is how it can monopolize people's lives, either through taking the time and effort to procure the substance, using the substance, and then recovering from the substance. It becomes a career in its own right.
Yeah.
And most of the time, you know, most of your sort of waking life gets taken up with those things. So there's pretty limited time to think about things like relationships or work or other some of the protective factors that we know are really important to stop people really, you know, experiencing negative harms as a result of their use. Rachel, anything else you'd like to add to that point?
I think it's very early on in my recovery. They said I was so desperate not to be an alcoholic, as I've already said, and somebody said to me, "Is your drinking costing you more than money?" And that was just a very, very clear, yeah, it cost me everything. And it was just, but that was I needed that kind of simplicity when I came in, because I was really keen to distance myself from alcoholism as an illness. And I just really didn't want to be, I wasn't ready to accept that that's what I was. So when someone said that and put it in those very simple terms, it was just very clear, like, yes, it is. So I've got a problem, so I need to sort it out, which was useful.
Yeah.
Okay. Just quickly, coming back, what Matt describes is so common when you're seeing people, that kind of narrowing as well, which I think Rachel alludes to in her narrowing of your attention, and, you know, all your efforts become taken over by you know, engaging in the next part of your behavior, by getting the drink, by you know, covering how you're going to hide it from people and so on and so forth. So your life becomes so restricted and dominated by that experience.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Just to all the participants, if you do want to ask questions, please do so. I think a couple of people have been trying to raise their hands, so if there's a point you want to make, just pop it into the questions and we'll see it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Yeah, so we've had a lot of requests around advice, really, in terms of, you know, what to do if you notice some of the things that we've been talking about, or things start to get to a point where your use of substances has got out of control. What can you do? So Matt, maybe you could sort of kick us off with this. What might somebody be able to do to get support?
Well, it's a great question, massively open-ended, and I will leave the clinicians to talk about the clinical side of things. And I think I'm just going to mention what's been mentioned already, is that the self-help groups, peer support groups and charities, there's a vast array of them out there. I personally am a member of a 12-step fellowship, and the 12 steps are a sort of are a way of learning how to deal with life without putting a drink or a drug or using another behavior. And, you know, I think, and we'll hopefully get to talk about this a bit later, but you know, it's not simply a question of just stopping the substance, because after all, you know, I certainly used substances for a reason to begin with. You know, the reason that I got on so famously with alcohol, which was my first drug of choice, was because it relieved the anxiety that I was feeling. It relieved you know, the feelings that I grew up with, of feeling less than or inferior or anxious or I am not enough, and all of that. And I replaced that with alcohol, which I alluded to earlier was a form of self-soothing. But putting the alcohol or the drugs down doesn't take away the feelings and the things that caused that caused me to do it to begin with. And so what I found in the 12-step fellowship was a really, really good way of dealing with all of that stuff by looking back across my life and looking at sort of, in quite a detailed way, and finding a new way to live, and almost a new set of standards to live by. And that you can find that in places like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous. And then there are great charities like Action on Addiction that have got great resources if you're interested in taking a journey towards abstinence. And you can find, if you Google Action on Addiction, you'll find their website. And it's really, or reach out to someone that you know to be in recovery, whatever in recovery might mean. But it's that first step of making a phone call. Ask somebody, how did you stop drinking? How did you stop taking drugs? Because I'm interested in it as well. There's no shame in being what is now called these days sober curious. There's no shame in it, in just sort of trying to find out. It's like, what did you do to stop? Because I'm having a look at my relationship with alcohol. I'm having a look at my relationship with drugs. And there's a lot of places now that sort of, that do it in a very different way. There's a great, I'm not endorsing it, but it looks pretty good to me. This thing called 1 Year No Beer, which is like more of a community support. And they do it through, I think through sports and challenges and stuff, so there's loads of different ways, because not everything will work for everybody. And the other thing is, and I noticed that someone posted something about this, it's like, if at first it doesn't work, keep trying, because you didn't get addicted overnight. So you might not necessarily stop that using those substances overnight. It might take a few attempts, and there's no shame in relapse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll come on to that. People's experiences are that maybe they've tried and things, have come back into their life that have put them at risk of using again. So yeah, just to sort of really echo that point, really, that, just because something hasn't been successful for you at one point in time doesn't mean that you can't make a change further down the line. Alex, let's think about sort of formal treatment services. If somebody's experiencing some physical health problems as a result of their drug use, what would your advice be in terms of getting support?
Well, one possible option is to go to see your general practitioner, for example, and GPs vary in how helpful or knowledgeable they are about these problems, but some are very in tune with this kind of difficulties, and they might need to refer you on. There are services available. If you go on the web, you should be able to seek your local services, and there'll be some NHS services for addiction problems, and these are particularly also relevant if you're having some physical problems that might need help in terms of assisted detoxification and this kind of problems. But there's also non-NHS organizations that provide counseling and help. The first step, I always say the first thing to do is start talking to someone about the problem. And that's what we were kind of talking about. You break that isolation, that silence, that shame. Just talk to someone. It could be a family member in the first instance, or it could be a close friend. Just open up that. And then try and look around. Possibly the GP is your first step. Possibly you can self-refer these days to services, and they'll need to talk to you to try and find out some detail about the problem, to try and assess whether you potentially might have some physical complications that they need to be attended to. In a lot of the cases, that's not an immediate concern, but if it is, then it needs to be dealt with. And then, as Matt was saying, in my experience, as long as you're trying, just keep trying. You might not find that the first port of call works for you, but certainly if you keep trying, you're going to find something that suddenly clicks, and it might make a difference for you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I just wanted to put a question maybe to you, Rachel, actually, from the perspective of having a problem at work. So the question we've had is on the behalf of an employer. So what advice do you have for employers who are trying to manage these sorts of problems with their workforce? And any sort of ideas there?
That's very tricky, because I get asked this a lot, because I talk publicly about this. I get asked, what can I do for this person? I've had like lots of phone calls from other musicians saying, this guy, for instance, is drinking himself to death. Like, what do we do? And there is an element of kind of powerlessness over somebody's using and drinking. And that is very, very difficult. It sounds almost callous to say there's nothing you can do. But I think the only thing that worked for me was when people were brave enough to tell me how my drinking affected them. Like, what I did with that information was up to me, and I had to be ready. I had to be completely ready, and to sort of admit that I had a problem, that I was going to surrender to the fact that I was powerless over alcohol. And it was quite a arduous journey, and sometimes I didn't want to hear it, and sometimes I got into kind of conflict with colleagues. But actually it was that it happened to me. I would turn up, you know, I was at college and I was doing sort of nothing very high powered particularly, but I was doing like wedding gigs, so playing in a string quartet at somebody's wedding. And I would be so anxious about like getting in the car and going to like an unknown hotel with a quartet that I hadn't played with before and see music I hadn't played with before, that I would drink. And a couple of people were brave enough to say to me, you know, you really smell of alcohol, which I thought that I was disguising. But once they kind of, they sort of mirrored my behavior back in sort of reality, as opposed to this kind of warped alcoholic thinking that I had, that was enough. The evidence kind of built up enough for me eventually to go, actually, other people are noticing this. So I think, you know, it's difficult because I've also been working with orchestras that have a zero tolerance policy about drinking in between a rehearsal and a performance. All that does is kind of increase stigma, shame, hiding. People just go to different pubs. There's a whole kind of rebellion attitude which happens. So the kind of punitive measure doesn't seem to work. But I just think, and it sounds a very trite thing to say and sort of nebulous, but just being able to have a conversation with someone about how their drinking is affecting them, and be as honest as you possibly can be, I think.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I mean, just to add on to that, I think, you know, just start to have the conversation. I appreciate it might be really difficult if you're the line manager of that person, for example, and you know, it might feel really difficult to begin to start having the conversation. Sometimes organizations have policies,
Yes.
and you might want to refer to the policy, or you might have a occupational health department within your organization. So look at the resources within your organization that could support you, or you might choose to get a healthcare professional involved as well via work. So absolutely appreciate it can be really difficult to have that conversation with people that you work with day in and day out. But yeah, for sure, start to have the conversation in some capacity. Okay, let's move on. I think this is a really interesting question we have next, which I think is likely to elicit quite a large response. And that's this one. What is the average time to recover from addiction? We did actually spend a bit of time talking about this even before we started sharing with all the participants. And we had a lot to say about it. Matt, would you like to sort of start us off with this?
Sorry, I just muted myself again. Thanks. I mean, my response to this question is basically, what is recovery, and how do you measure it? How do you measure it in time? How do you measure it in quality? How do you measure it in quantity? My personal belief is you can't. And the average time it takes to recover from addiction is, and I'm not saying this in any way to try and be clever, but it's the average time that one is awake in any given 24-hour period. Because, You know, I know people who've been sober for a very short period of time and seem to be in far better shape than I am often. You know, I've been in recovery for you know, for a while, and I still have some terrible days. And I know people who've been in recovery 30, 40 or 50 years, you know, and I might say, I might see them and think they need to go back to kindergarten. You know, it's so it's really, it's an unquantifiable thing. And I think, you know, to me, and I'll defer to Rachel on this, but recovery is it's a daily process as well as a lifelong process. And you know, in AA we do measure it periods of continuous sobriety. That's really so we can show other people it's possible. You know, me saying I've been sober for X number of years isn't to tell you how great I am. It's to tell you that it is possible not to have a drink for a number of consecutive days, or not to take a drug for a number of consecutive days. But in terms of an average time, you know, I'm sure clinically there's a different answer, but my answer is it's impossible to say. I'm sorry. But Rachel, you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I would second that, and I'm very keen to call myself a recovering alcoholic, because I know that and any given day, the fact that, I mean, I've done a risky thing, and I've tattooed my sobriety date on my, you can't see it, on my wrist here, which is, you know, 2007 was my first sober day, and it's the most important thing to me that I'm physically sober, but how I am emotionally, as that's just been shared, is definitely a daily thing, and I'm definitely recovering. But I was somebody who drank at least a bottle of vodka a day, and I took Valium and beta blockers, and the physical withdrawal symptoms, I did a home detox with Librium, and I started to feel physically better after a couple of weeks. Then and then it took me quite a long time to kind of feel emotionally better, because I had I'd put alcohol on top of panic attacks basically for years and years and years. So I put down my medicine, and the panic came up, and I would sit in meetings, and I felt infinitely worse initially, because obviously I'd put my medicine down, but I was surrounded by people, and I had a mentor that just kept reassuring me that if I stuck with it, it would go. And I'd be like, when? You know, and people would come up to me and say, this too shall pass. And I'd want to grab them by the lapels and kind of go, I can't bear another minute. But I actually started to feel physically and emotionally and spiritually better within months, because I'd connected with a fellowship of other people in the same, you know, I just felt less isolated. I was physically not, I wasn't physically addicted, so I wasn't experiencing DTs or withdrawals when I woke up in the morning. I no longer gagged every time I cleaned my teeth, which was a major thing. I could eat, I could answer the phone, I could open letters. So very, very quickly, I was able to do things that I just thought were impossible to do. I mean, I was somebody that had to have a drink before I got in the shower, because I would hyperventilate in the shower. So I was that girl. And within months, I was able to, you know, it was uncomfortable, definitely, but I was somebody who could go, I wasn't playing the cello for a living. I was working in a parking permit department in a borough council, half a day, and then I'd go to a meeting. But that was like a big full day for me at that time. And I was somebody that literally couldn't do anything without drinking vodka that was on the floor. So actually, the physical relief came quite quickly, but I do think my continued emotional sobriety in my life, you know, I'm a mother of 2 children, for instance, and in my working life and how well I am on a day-to-day basis, it's definitely daily. And I have to keep plugging away at the recovery behaviours in order to keep that sobriety. And I was very, very keen. I was a big box ticker when I first came into recovery, and I thought, I just want to do all the things that they say, and then I want to be fixed, and maybe I'll be able to drink like a lady. And I realised very quickly that I am not somebody who can take alcohol, even a drop of alcohol, with impunity. So I consider myself a success if I haven't picked up a drink in any given day. But how my head is a different story.
Thanks, Rachel. Alex, do you have any perspective from somebody who's been involved in treatment services?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a very difficult question, and it all hinges on what you mean by recovering. And I think it's a lifelong journey, isn't it? I mean, perhaps if you ask how long might it take for things to improve, we can hear from the stories that things can improve very quickly.
Yeah.
And then is about further improvement or maintaining that improvement over the long period of time. And that's a lifelong journey. And whether you have an addiction or whether you don't, you're going to have lots of challenges. But partly if you have an addiction, those challenges are going to remind you of what it was like before, and you're going to worry that you're going to slip back into that. And I find from some people, the recovering is hugely helpful, and they couldn't make the progress they could without thinking in that way. And then I find other people that after a year, they feel they want to leave that behind and they want to move on to a next stage. So, you know, but the average time, I think, is a really difficult question to answer. I mean, there's clearly some evidence that over the first 6 months, if you become abstinent, the more confident you feel and the less temptation hits you. As those things, one goes up, confidence goes up, temptation goes down, and then you feel much more secure after 6 months or so. But relapse can occur anytime. So, but it doesn't mean relapse is part of the problem, is part of the addiction. So it's how you respond to that relapse that's important in the long term. So I think, like Rachel and Matt were illustrating, recovery is a lifelong journey, but improvement can happen quickly. I think I'm trying to balance it in some way. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolute sense. And I guess if you sort of widen recovery to include other parts of your life that don't relate to substance use, then that sort of thinks about improvements and recovery in relation to your relationships or your employment or your housing. So it's not always just about, you know, making change in relation to your substance of choice. It's about these many other things around your life that can also recover and improve as well. Okay, thanks for that. We've probably got about 5 or 10 minutes left. If anybody wants to get any last minute questions into us, I think we've tried to cover most of the ones that have come through, but you've still got a chance to put in a couple more questions. Let me just try and jump forward with the time that we've got left, because I think this is, again, a pretty common question that we've had, which is a bit more practical, I guess. What can I do when I feel I need a drink, and how can I stop myself? And again, this may be a very sort of subjective experience. I mean, Rachel, would you mind sort of sharing what worked for you? What did you find helpful?
I had a couple of attempts at getting sober. So the first time I had sort of 7 months of sort of white knuckle recovery, which has meant that I was fighting the urge to drink the whole time, and I was just kind of gripping on, that's what I call it, white knuckling it. And what I didn't do during that time was truly connect with another person when I was feeling really vulnerable. Drink was still a kind of background solution in my head. I had this lasting thought that was, I guess it was like the last vestiges of denial, really, which was, if this gets really bad, I can always drink, as an option. What changed for me and what stopped me from relapsing was meeting we call them sponsors. She's a mentor, really. I met her and she said, don't bother ringing me after you've had a drink. You have to ring me before you have a drink. So there are lots of physical things that make you more vulnerable to a drink. So you're less likely to drink, for instance, on a full stomach, apparently. Lots of people told me to have a Mars bar instead of a drink. So the sugar thing, that can, like, if we're talking about physical cravings, I mean, it sounds very basic, but, you know, things like going for a walk, things to get you out of your own mind. But I think the real thing for me, and there's a really famous TED talk, isn't there, about the opposite of addiction being connection. And for me, it still is the answer to all my problems, is to reach out to another alcoholic and say, I'm feeling like this. And they will offer me a solution that I haven't thought of, because I've got a bit of my brain that almost has a different voice to the rest of my brain, which is the addict, which will tell me to just annihilate and just escape, get out, whatever I'm feeling. So when I connect with another alcoholic and ask for help, I get immediate relief from that, and I feel like I'm engaging in the solution and I can carry on. That was the big game changer for me. There was nothing kind of, I tried hypnotherapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, analysis, loads of stuff before I came into recovery. And the thing that helped was being honest about how I was feeling with another person who could mirror a solution back to me. And that has been how I've stayed sober all this time. It's still the same today.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Alex, from a sort of treatment perspective, what might we suggest to people in terms of helping them cope when they have this sort of experience?
Is everything that Rachel is saying is just trying to pass on some of those skills to people. And I sometimes use the analogy of a fire drill with people that, you prepare for a fire drill. It doesn't mean necessarily you're going to face a fire, but at the time when there's a danger of fire, you need to go into automatic mode and just follow a drill. And sometimes it's good to have like a plan. We plan for all sorts of things. It's good to plan. Okay, if I feel really particularly vulnerable on a date, what am I going to do? One, I'm going to ring, Jane or my sponsor, and I discuss with her, as a bit like what you say, Rachel. You discuss with her. You're going to ring her. If you ring her, she'll know it's because you're about to drink, as opposed to you drink. So she needs to be prepared to respond quickly if she can. Number two, I'm going to go for a walk and I'm going to leave this environment where I am, where I'm feeling very tempted, and so on and so forth. So I know it might feel like one is thinking things are easier than they are. I know exactly when you're there, it's really difficult. But the more prepared you are, the more you plan in advance, the more you have those people around you potentially prepared to help you out, the more chances you're going to have. And if it happens and you do have a drink, then stop there. Don't tell yourself, I failed, I'm a failure, I'm never going to recover. No, okay, I've had a slip. Let me get back in time. I'm going to get back on track again. Okay, no one's perfect. I had a slip. Let me get it back on track and I'll carry on. Yeah, don't hurt yourself. Don't punish yourself even more because of that kind of slip.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a whole series of strategies that you can put into place by thinking about them before the event happens. So this whole idea that it just becomes inevitable because I've been surprised by it, and what's the point in even trying to resist it because I've already had that one drink. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do to think about what strategies, protective ones, adaptive ones, you can put in place to stop you from relapsing completely. So yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Matt, what did you find worked for you?
Eating.
Yeah.
Eating a lot, and chocolate. Joking aside, because I know that chocolate can be eating can be a sensitive issue for some, but what Rachel said, you're less likely to want to drink on an empty stomach, which is true. And I drank gallons of coffee, gallons of Diet Coke, and not particularly good for me. But at the time, it helped keep me away from a drink, and that was and still is my primary purpose. And so, sort of doing anything to take away the craving, sugar. When if it was a really strong craving, a fiery ginger ale. Something with loads of bubbles in it. Chocolate, Mars bars, like Rachel said. There's a very good. Well, I would say that, but there is a very helpful blog on the Action on Addiction website on relapse and relapse prevention, which you can get to if you just Google Action on Addiction and go there and find it. I co-wrote it, so I would say it's quite useful, but it is.
Could I add something there, actually? The other thing that really helped me was that somebody said to me, I think as an addict, I'm always frightened that I'm stuck in a feeling and that the feeling of the craving will never leave. And just someone saying, this is going to go within maybe half an hour or an hour, you're going to feel different. And I know that sounds pathetically simple, but I had so much fear of sort of dying from my feelings as an addict and being so hypersensitive. When someone said to me, actually, you'll be thinking about something else in an hour, that was just like took the sort of the gravity of it away. That helped me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. We often describe it as surfing a wave.
Yes.
It is going to extinguish itself. The craving, the urge will go. It's often the case that you shift your attention from the craving or the urge onto something more neutral. So, you know, we've seen things like mindfulness-based relaxation become really important in helping people just shift their attention onto something more neutral. But yes, and that's a really key point to stress, really, that, you know, the urge will go eventually.
Yes.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of time, so I think if we can just try and pick up a couple of questions. There was a lot to try and get through, but I think, Alex, if I can put this one to you, there's been a couple of questions about other people. So people who are family members, or in this case, children of people who have got an addiction problem. What help is there for them?
Okay, we're running out of time, which is a shame, because it would have been good to have a bit more time to talk about this, but I'll try and keep it very brief. To me, the main thing is when you're a family member close to someone with an addiction problem, life can be very, very stressful indeed. And we know, I've done research, I've interviewed families from hundreds of families over the years, and I know how long some of this can go on for, and how stressful and often leading to psychological symptoms of stress and physical symptoms of stress this can be to family members. And often family members are a bit isolated, so they're not taken as part of the equation, certainly not by services, although that is changing. It has changed in the last few years. So if you're a family member now, you can ring an addiction service in your own right and ask for someone to talk to about your experience. And I would suggest if you are experiencing that, you should do that. The other thing is to think, a lot of families think that they're dealing with a thing that is very unique and that, you know, they feel very isolated, very lonely. Stigma prevents them in the same way, prevents the person with the addiction problem from talking about it with other people. And again, you need to break that. There's a book by a New Zealand psychologist called Fragmented Intimacies, and it talks about how addiction has this impact on relationships, which Matt and Rachel were touching on, where everything becomes very fragmented and people become very isolated from each other. Most of the time, family members are trying to respond to the situation in whatever way they can. And most of the time they feel unsure as to, are they worried? What's the extent of the problem? What is the reality of it? What should they do? Are they making it worse? And there's a whole host of questions that they have. There's also self-help groups for family members affected in the same way that you have self-help groups for people with addiction problems. So my suggestion would be to try and look for local services for addiction, and look for the bit where they advertise that you can contact as a family member in your own right, and get some support that way. There's organizations such as AdFund, for example, that work for supporting family members of people with addiction problems across the UK and other places. So I feel as if I'm rushing this, and it almost needs attention as a theme in its own right. But the key message is, don't panic. These experiences are very common indeed. Try and talk about it and try and find some source of support. And again, the road might be a long one, but things could improve quite quickly if you have an opportunity to talk to someone and think through. We found that equally to what we're saying about people with addiction problems, if family members have an opportunity to talk about their experience to someone who non-judgmentally listens and hears the story, immediately those symptoms can go down quite quickly. So it's not about expensive treatment or whatever, it's just about having an opportunity to talk to someone who's just going to listen and not jump into giving advice, because family members often worry that they're not doing the right thing, and what they need is a little bit of reassurance and support so they can carry on in that journey.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we could probably spend another hour talking about the needs of family members. And just the last question to Rachel and Matt, if I may, a really simple one, or maybe not so simple. What advice would you give to somebody who's thinking about making a change in relation to their addiction?
Matt?
Somebody who's thinking about making a change is, well, go for it. Don't be frightened. You know, if you're thinking that you might have a problem, it's quite likely that you do. You know, pick up the phone. It is really what I would say. Pick up the phone to a 12-step help group. Pick up the phone to AA or NA, or visit a charity website like Action on Addiction, or you know, like the ones that Alex mentioned, if you're a family member. Just don't. And also the other thing is, I would say, is seize the moment. What I found in my experience was that I would have windows of willingness to deal with my addiction, windows of desperation to deal with my addiction. They didn't last that long. And I went through many of those windows without doing anything. And, you know, and finally I just had enough. And so really, you know, take action, seize the opportunity. I would say one other thing is, I've seen a few things pop up in the chat. And, you know, to Terry, help is out there for you. You know, pick up the phone and give AA a call. If you can do 150 days once, you can do it again. You know, it's all out there for you. And please go out there and get help.
Rachel, last word for you.
I think Matt's just said everything. I think the thing that stopped me from doing that, from getting help, was just the idea that I was so stuck in my addiction that I had no idea that there was a different life. And if someone had told me then what I was capable of now, I would have just told them they were mad. So just, it's a leap of faith. It's a real leap of faith, but for me, there was just no alternative, and it is possible to have a completely different life. Even if you feel completely entrenched in, you know, in your illness, there's recoveries out there, and it's amazing. That's it.
Absolutely. I think just before we finish, just to sort of really stress that point, recovery is visible. There are so many stories of people coming from really desperate positions to changing their life around and reclaiming a sense of identity and all of the things that they lost throughout the stage of their difficulties with substances. So I think if you are struggling, please do reach out for support, either from your GP or even a family member or a work colleague. Start the process, please, because change is absolutely possible, and no matter how difficult things can seem right at the moment. Just to repeat, we'll put this webinar on YouTube, and there'll be a whole bunch of links around support. Support will be available to you wherever you are in the UK or beyond. There's even virtual meetings that you can attend. So even if you can't physically get to a service, there'll be support that's available for you. So I hope that's been helpful for everybody that's been watching, and really appreciate the panel's time. Thank you so much. And maybe we'll do it again if there's enough interest. So that's all. Thank you so much.